I want to continue the sermon series on preparing your children for the real world. I suppose I should have called it children. I don't know. Somebody online chastised me about saying kids instead of children. But anyway, preparing your kids for the real world. If you remember last time, we talked about child discipline and how it is necessary before you can really train and impart knowledge and wisdom to your children that they must first be disciplined. And I talked about why child discipline is necessary. And it's necessary for the children and it's necessary for the parents and really all involved. And now I want to get into the second point here, and we want to talk about what types of behavior merit discipline. And when I say discipline, I'm really speaking of corporal discipline in this case. I'm not going to go through all of the types of behavior. My last point will pretty much sum up all the types of behavior and just say sin in general, but I want to give you some major ones that you want to definitely look for in your children, and when these things happen, these things must be punished with the rod. And I guess let me just get this out of the way. I'm going to get to the rod later on in the sermon, but when I say beating your child with a rod, what I mean is like a dowel rod or something like that, like maybe a 1/4-inch dowel rod or something like that, or maybe 3/8, I don't know. Anyway, and striking the child on the butt with it, okay? So I'm not talking about injuring the child permanently or any such thing like that. I'm not talking about abusing the child. I'm talking about just the good old-fashioned, like our grandparents used to do, get the switch off the tree, the little slender shoot or wand, and striking him on the butt with it. That's what I'm talking about. But I'll get to that later, but I just wanted to, whenever I talk about using the rod, I just wanted you to have the proper idea in your head of what I'm talking about as we go through this. So the first behavior that must be punished with the rod is rebellion. Rebellion must never be tolerated. That's something as a parent that you cannot and should not tolerate. Rebellion is open or determined defiance of or resistance to any authority or controlling power. So when your children openly defy you, when you tell them do something, and I don't care what it is, it could be the simplest thing, when you say do it and they say no, or they just walk away and ignore you, which is the same as saying no, that's rebellion. That should be met with the rod. Rebellion, the scripture teaches us, is actually equivalent to witchcraft. If you look in 1 Samuel 15 and verse 23, this is nothing to mess with. This is not a light matter. When you tell your kids to do something and they ignore you or defy you and just say no, that is not just something like, oh, well, they're kids, that's just how they act. No, that is likened unto witchcraft. 1 Samuel 15 and verse 23. For rebellion, Samuel is telling Saul this, because Saul didn't do what the Lord told him to do. Saul almost did everything that the Lord told him to do, if you remember, but he spared what was his name? The king of the Amalekites, Agag, I think was his name. He spared the king, and he spared the best of the animals to sacrifice unto the Lord. But he did slay pretty much everybody else, so he almost kept the whole commandment, and yet Samuel charges him with rebellion because he didn't do everything the Lord said. And he says there in verse 23, for rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry, because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. Remember, preparing your kids for the real world, and I want to show you as we go through this why each of these things prepares your kid for the real world. God rejected Saul from being king. Saul lost his job, if you will, and that's to put it lightly. He lost his job for rebellion. Your kids will do likewise. They will lose their jobs for rebellion. This is part of preparing your kids for the real world. Now, if you think about it, if you had a child that came home to you, or you came home to your child, and you found out that they've been reading books on witchcraft and on the occult, and they've been practicing spells, and they've been communicating with the dead, and they've been doing other occult practices, and doing absolutely spiritually reprehensible things. They've been practicing witchcraft, in other words. Maybe they've been reading Harry Potter or something. If they've been doing that kind of thing, would you come home and just say, well, they're kids. That's just kind of what kids do? No, you wouldn't, right? That would be met with the rod. I mean, if anything should be met with the rod, I would say that should be met with the rod. And God says that is likened unto rebellion. That kind of thing, dabbling in the occult, is likened unto rebellion. Both ought to be met with the rod. So when you tell your children to do anything and they openly defy you, they should be beaten with the rod the first time. Now, if you came home and you found your kid practicing witchcraft, would you say, "Now, son, I don't want you to do that anymore"? And he just continues on making his spells, and you come down home the next day, "Now, son, get out of that witchcraft stuff. Son, get out of that witchcraft." You're gonna keep telling him? No, you're going to tell him one time. You're going to beat the tar out of him, biblically speaking, of course. And you're going to throw that stuff away and destroy it, right? You're going to fix the problem. Same thing with rebellion in a child. Now, the second thing that ought to be punished with the rod is very similar to rebellion, and that is disobedience to parents, or I would say grandparents, teachers, adults in general. Now, the other people that are listed there, they don't have the authority to beat your children, but I actually recommend giving them that authority if you trust them, if you know them well enough and trust them. I would personally give grandparents, teachers, babysitters, aunts, uncles, I'd give them permission to spank my kids while they were unruly in their care. I would have no issue doing that whatsoever. My brother's done that for me. I've spanked my nieces before. I didn't use a rod. I don't think he really approves of that, but I spanked him with my hand, but with his permission. And it worked out pretty well. My niece wasn't up throwing a fit and breaking stuff in the house with the ball anymore after I did that. So I would do that. Because if you don't do that, and if you leave your kid with a babysitter and just say, "Now be good," but you tell the babysitter, "Don't you touch him, I'll take care of it when I get home," that could be effective, but it also could be giving the babysitter a lot of grief. I would give them, and teachers, I would absolutely give teachers the permission to, if my kids were in school, to beat them with the rod as necessary if they were rebellious and disobedient, things like that. I would say even good, and I know this for a fact, even good, well-disciplined kids will push a babysitter. And I've been there. I have babysat good, well-disciplined kids, and even they're going to push you as a babysitter to see what they can get away with. Even really good kids, they will push you. And I would recommend just giving your babysitter some teeth. If you trust them, if you don't trust them, why are they babysitting for you anyway? Give them some teeth and tell them right in front of the kid, "You disobey this babysitter, the babysitter gets to spank you with a rod." And then everybody's on the same page, and the babysitter's going to have a lot easier time. But if you don't want to do that, don't do it. But that's just my personal opinion. I think you should teach your children to obey adults when they know them. So if you have adults that your children know, you ought to teach them to obey them. Not strangers, I'm not talking about that. But in that case, because, like for instance, you got to teach your kids to obey the pastor. If we're in the church room and the kids are running around here and they're getting a little rowdy, and I tell the kid, "Stop running, stop yelling," you ought to teach your children to obey the pastor and listen to what he says. Because it's not fair to me. I can't spank your kids, right? And if I tell them to stop running and they just pay me no mind, then what am I going to do? Then I look like I'm a paper tiger. I look like I have no authority. So what am I going to do? So you ought to teach your children to obey adults that they know, and never let your kids say this to adults, to family members, aunts, uncles, grandparents: "You're not my mommy. You're not my daddy." You ever heard that crap? You ever said it when you were a kid? I said it when I was a kid. And my aunt that I said it to ought to got permission from my dad and beat the tar out of me too for saying it to her. "You're not my mommy." Yeah, well, I would never want to hear that coming out of my kid's mouth, I can tell you that. Okay, so disobedience to parents specifically. The Bible teaches that children must obey their parents. Look at Ephesians 6 and verse 1. I saw one time, this is a great example, and I learned a lot from it. I was in another church in the church where we used to have the Ecclesiastical Law Center. And there was a young boy, he was doing something, I don't know, he was running around by the piano or touching the piano or something. I don't remember exactly what he was doing. And the pastor told him to stop doing that or get away from that. And he and I don't know if the kid didn't pay attention, and the pastor grabbed him by the arm and he said, "Stop doing that or be quiet," or whatever. And the kid kind of looked at him and he said, "The answer is yes, sir." And the kid said, "Yes, sir." And he walked away. That pastor had authority. And the parent of that kid was certainly not going to go up and tell the pastor, "Hey, don't you lay your hand on my kid." That was, I thought, wow, that's how a pastor ought to act towards unruly children in the church. I really appreciated that. Anyway, Ephesians 6 and verse 1. It says, "Children, Obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment, with promise that it may be well with thee, and that thou mayest live long on the earth. There's a blessing in this for your children. If they obey you, God will bless them to live long upon the earth. It does say obey your parents in the Lord. So you only obey when parents are giving instructions that are biblical to their children. So you wouldn't obey your parents if they told you to go kill somebody, for instance. But that's generally not an issue. Generally, when parents are telling small children to do things, generally they're telling them to do the right thing, and kids should obey. Look at Colossians 3 and verse 20. I just had a thought, because I talked about last week about me not having kids yet, and that's kind of in the back of my mind. And I thought, think about something. The majority of the instruction that we get to children and to married couples in the New Testament came from two people who were not married and did not have children. Jesus Christ and the Apostle Paul. You get more instruction about children and marriage from those two men who were not married and did not have children than you do from anybody else in the Scripture. I just thought that was interesting. Colossians 3 and verse 20. You say, well, you're not Jesus or the Apostle Paul. But I'm reading their words, so what's the difference? Colossians 3 and verse 20. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord. This makes the Lord happy when children obey their parents. So disobedience must be punished. Now, the next sentence that I'm going to say to you, I want you to pay attention. I think this is probably one of the most important things that I'm going to tell you in this sermon today. And that is that you don't need to say something more than once to your children. I'll say it again. You don't need to say something more than once to your children. You only need to tell them one time and they should obey. Now, it's going to take a little training to get them to do that. The first time you try to put this into practice and tell them once, they're going to pay attention to you, if they haven't been paying attention to you prior to that. But you can train them to obey the first time. Once again, preparing your kids for the real world. When they get in the real world and they work for a boss, is the boss going to have to tell them repeatedly to do this or that? No, at least he shouldn't. If I was somebody's boss and I told him to do something and I had to keep repeating myself, I'd fire him. He'd be out of there. You don't want that to happen to your kids. Is the policeman, is he going to tell you multiple times to do this or that? Get out of the car. Now, whether or not he's even supposed to be able to do that anyway, but is he going to tell you multiple times? Get out of the car. And you just kind of sit there and pretend like you didn't hear. Whack! Get out of the car, right? The cop's not going to put up with delayed obedience, and neither should you. You should teach your kids to obey the first time. If obedience is not met with the rod at the first offense, it definitely should be at the second. If you're going to tell them twice, and I don't recommend that, you're just wasting your breath and you're teaching them things. I'm going to show you. You're teaching them a whole bunch of things. When you tell them twice, you've taught them a whole bunch of things, and you probably didn't even realize all the things that you've just taught them whenever you tell them to do something twice. But if it's not met with the rod the first time, definitely the second time. You should never have to repeat yourself more than once, and even that's too much. Here's the thing. You say, well, I want to give them a little bit of leeway anyway. I tell them once, and maybe they just, they weren't paying attention or something. So here's what you do. You tell them once, and then you ever hear of the look? Remember your parents when you were younger? Your parents had the look, right? All they had to do is look at you, and you knew that right after the look, like if one more second transpires, my butt is going to hurt. Remember that? Anybody? You ever been there? Right? The look. All you got to do is train your kids. You tell them one time, and they do it. If they don't do it immediately, you give them a look. You don't yell at them. You don't scream at them. You don't tell them again. You don't do anything. You just look at them. And you give them about a second or two. And if they don't act then they get the rod immediately. I guarantee you this will work. They should know that the rod immediately follows the look. See, you train them that they must obey the first time you tell them to do something. When they don't obey, when they're told to do something, then you spank them with the rod. This is very simple, right? Now, don't confuse simple and easy. I'm not saying it's easy, right? I'm not saying that at all. But it is very simple. You tell them something, they don't obey, you spank them with a rod. Anybody can understand that. Is there anybody here that does not understand that simple formula? Tell them they don't obey, spank them with a rod. Everybody get it? Everybody? Okay. Everybody, that's simple. Easy? I'm not saying it's easy. Simple, right? Very simple. It's going to take some time doing this, but not that much time. If you do it consistently, every time, it won't take much time at all. And guess what? You're going to speak and they're going to act. It's a beautiful thing. It can work. It will work if you do it. I can guarantee it. They will quickly learn that you mean what you say, and you won't have to repeat yourself anymore. You're not going to have to tell them over and over again. They're going to know when dad or mom says something, I do it, and if I don't, I get a spanking. And they're going to know that the spanking is coming, but you've got to be consistent. If you do this, you've got to do it 100% of the time. Because if you're not consistent, if you even do it 75% of the time, it's not going to work. Because your kid's never going to really know when dad says something, is the spanking coming if I don't obey right now, or maybe I'll get away with it like I did the other day. And then he's going to test you, and he's going to try you, and it's not going to work. You've got to be consistent 100% of the time, it'll work. Now, not making them obey the first time, it teaches them some things. It teaches them at least 6 things. Maybe more than that, but I thought about 6 things. You see, you're going to teach them either way. You're either going to teach them to obey the first time, and you're going to teach them that you are a man or a woman of authority, that you mean what you say, and that you're not going to put up with any crap. You're going to teach them that, or you're going to teach them these other things if you don't make them obey the first time. The first thing that you're going to teach them is that you don't really mean what you say. Because if you say, do this, and they don't do it, and then you don't do anything about it, or you have to tell them again, you didn't really mean what you said. Because if you really meant what you said, you would have enforced what you said, right? The second thing that you're going to teach your kids, if you don't make them obey the first time, is that you don't keep your word. Because you've probably told them in the past that when I tell you to do something, you obey, and if you don't obey, you're going to get punished for it. But if you tell them the first time they don't obey, they don't get punished, guess what? You didn't keep your word. You've taught your children that you do not keep your word. The third thing, and I know this sounds mean, but you teach your children, if you don't make them obey the first time, you teach them that you are weak and pathetic. And I know that sounds mean, but you've really taught them that. And let me give you an example. Let's say I walk into a bank and there's a security guard at the bank, and he's standing in front of the vault. And the vault's hanging wide open. And I walk up and he says, don't go inside that vault. Right here is this line. Do not cross this line. And I just say, meh. And I walk right around him, and I walk in the vault, and I check it out. I'm kind of just playing with stuff in there. And I look back, and he just kind of sheepishly just looks at me like, well, what am I going to do? You know what I'm going to think of that guy? Weak and pathetic. No authority, no power. This guy is, what the heck's he even doing? He doesn't even have any business being a security guard. On the other hand, if I walk up and he says, don't cross this line, and I walk around him, and the next thing that I feel is a billy club across the back of the head, I'm going to be like, yeah, this guy's a man of authority. This guy means what he says. And guess what? I am definitely not going to walk across that line, or I'm not going to do anything he ever tells me not to do again. I'm going to know that that guy, when he says don't do this or do this, guess what? I'm going to do it or not do it. Because I know the billy club's coming across the back of the head, right? That's why I say if you tell your kids to do something and then they just disregard, you've just shown them that you're weak and pathetic because you can't enforce your commandments. Or you don't. The fourth thing that you teach your kids when you don't make them obey the first time is that they are in control. You realize that, right? When you tell them to do something and they don't do it on the first time, who's in control? They are in control. They decide whether they're going to do what you told them to do or whether they're not. So you've showed them who's in control. Now they may think, oh yeah, dad and mom are theoretically in charge around here, right? Dad and mom appear to be in control, but guess who's really in control? I'm in control. I decide when I do it or when I don't. If I want to do it, I'll do it. If I don't want to do it, I won't do it. And I don't have anything to worry about because I know I'm going to be told at least 2 more times before I actually have to do anything. I'm in control, at least for the first 1 or 2 commandments. After that, maybe mom and dad are in control, but I'm in control for a while anyway. The fifth thing that this teaches them, to not make them obey the first time, is that obedience is optional. Right? You're really teaching them that you can obey if you want, or you don't have to obey. Because if there's no punishment for the disobedience the first time, then obedience is optional. Now, do you want to teach your kids that obedience is optional? And I'm talking about obedience to God-ordained rule and authority. No, you don't want to teach your kids that. Sixthly, you teach them, and this would be an extrapolation, but you teach them that they don't have to obey God's commandments when they don't feel like it. Because remember, as parents, you are in God's stead. God has given you the responsibility to train up children for Him. So you are in His stead, and you are executing His law upon these children. And whenever you don't make them obey the first time, you know what you're teaching them? In effect, they don't have to obey God's commandments unless they feel like it. And God's got to tell them numerous times before they have to obey and before punishment comes. You don't want to teach your kids that either. Now, what a lot of parents do is they tell them the first time and the kid totally ignores them. Then they raise their voice and tell them the second time, right? This happens a lot. I'm sure we've all been there. I'm sure we've all seen this, right? You tell them once, they ignore you. You tell them a second time in a raised voice. But you know, that teaches them something too. Telling them the second time in a raised voice teaches your children that they only have to obey when you raise your voice, right? You're training them. Whatever you allow them to do, you're training them. And now you've taught them that the only time you have to obey me is whenever I raise my voice. If I speak in a calm voice, you don't have to obey me. Forget about it, especially if it's only the first time. Now, if I raise my voice, then you better obey, because chances are you're going to get spanked. You've just taught them to only obey when you raise your voice. Now, what's that going to end up being for you? You know what this happens? You know what happens when this happens? You make yourself look like an idiot in public. You're that parent that's yelling at his kids all the time, at the restaurant, at the mall, out in the yard, wherever. You're that guy that's always yelling at his kids, right? You don't want to be that guy, right? When I see a parent yelling at their kids, I see a parent that doesn't have control of their kids. This teaches your children that the only effective way to cause someone to do something is by yelling at them, right? Because you've trained them. When you tell them in a calm voice, they know they don't have to listen. When you yell at them, then they know they have to listen. So now you've trained them, oh, I only listen when I get yelled at. Therefore, if I only listen when I get yelled at, then apparently everybody else only listens when they get yelled at. And therefore, when I want something, I yell. That's what you've taught them. Now, do you wonder why, if your children yell at each other, might that be the reason? Might the reason be that they yell at each other when they want their siblings to do something, and it doesn't happen immediately? Might that be the reason? Because they've learned it somewhere else. Now, your children will figure out at what point they must obey or else a spanking's coming. Your kids are very smart. I think sometimes they're smarter than their parents. They will figure out where the line is. They'll know when the spanking's coming. And guess what? They're little sinners, and they're going to go right up to that line. Wherever that line is, they will push right to the line. Here's the simple thing. Bring the line to the first commandment. Bring the line to the first commandment. You don't have to repeat yourself. You don't have to yell. You don't have to... None of that stuff. Your kids will know when the spanking's coming. If they learn from a very young age that the spanking comes after the first command, they will quickly learn to obey the first command. But that's the trick. You've got to teach them that the spanking comes immediately after the first command. Now, if they learn that the spanking comes after the second command, they will only obey the second command. Why would I obey the first command when it's something that I don't want to do, right? When you command your kids to do something, generally it's something they don't want to do, or you wouldn't have had to command them to do it. Why would I bother obeying the first commandment when I know that the spanking doesn't come until after I disobey the second commandment? You see, your kids are smart. They figure these things out real quickly. That's why if you don't make them obey the first time, you're always going to have to tell them at least twice. You're always going to have to do that. Now, if they learn that the spanking comes after you scream repeatedly, I missed the point. If they learn that the spanking comes after the second command is screamed, then they'll only obey you when you scream at them. If they learn that the spanking comes after you scream repeatedly and get red in the face, then they'll only obey when they're screamed at repeatedly by a red-faced, insane, foolish parent. Right? And this happens. I read about it. James Dobson talks about this in his book, and he gives a scenario where you tell the kid it's time to get a bath. Go get a bath. And he pays no attention. And then you say, all right, Johnny, it's time to get a bath. Go get a bath. And he pays no attention. Then you, Johnny, and then you start screaming, go get a bath. He pays no attention. He knows that whenever mom starts screaming and her blood vessels are popping out of her forehead and she's calling him all kinds of names and making all these crazy threats, she knows that at some point, okay, I'm going to get it, or he knows, I'm going to get a spanking. But what's he going to do? He's going to wait until mom starts screaming repeatedly and acting like an idiot. That's when he's going to obey, because he knows that's when the punishment comes. Here's a truth. I believe this is true. You don't believe it's true? Then explain to me why this is not true. Most children, I realize there are some hard-headed fools out there, but most children will obey when they are certain a spanking is coming immediately following the disobedience of a command. Most kids are bright enough to figure that out. They're not that hard-hearted, or hard-headed, I mean. If they are certain the spanking is coming immediately after the commandment, they're going to obey the commandment. There are a few of them that just like pain, I think, and they'll like, I heard that Conrad, back when he was a kid, he used to weigh the consequences. He knew that if he broke certain rules, that certain spankings were coming, and he would just weigh it out and say, I'll just take the spanking, I really want to do this. But most kids are probably, if they're certain it's coming, they're just going to obey. They don't want to get the spanking. But why do they disobey then? Because they're not certain. If they're not certain, there's always that chance that maybe half the time I get spanked, half the time I don't. I'll take the chance because maybe this time I'll win. Why do you think people play the lottery? Because once in a while they win. If your kids win once in a while, they're always going to keep playing the game. When a confrontation comes between a parent and a child, the parent must always win. Never, ever let your child win. And I'm talking about a disciplinary issue. Never let them win. I don't care. Some of them are strong-willed, and I'm sure it's very difficult. And you got to keep doing it over and over again. You got to keep spanking them. You got to keep fighting with them. You know what? You cannot let them win. You must win. Because if you don't, they're going to be in control for the rest of their lives. So you just establish a rule that they get spanked immediately when they do not obey, and then you stick to it consistently. And I'd say do so for a week or so, and you'll have obedient children and a peaceful home. I really believe this. Now, if you think I'm wrong, I would offer you a challenge. Just do this very thing. Practice for a week. You tell them something, they don't obey, they get a spanking immediately. Immediately. You never repeat yourself one time, ever. Spanking comes the next time. And do this consistently for a week and don't miss a beat. And I am certain that your children will have learned after that time that when you speak, they do. If it doesn't work, invite me over to your house and invite me. I'm going to bring my sleeping bag. I'm going to come and stay for 3 days and 3 nights. I know that nobody wants this. I'll stay for 3 days and 3 nights, and I will observe. And if you do this, I mean, you give the commandment and give a spanking every single time. If I watch you do that for 3 days and 3 nights, and they're still not obeying you the first commandment, I will publicly retract what I've said. Okay, so I'll throw up the challenge. I will publicly retract everything I've said. This is all theory that doesn't work. So there you go. So you just proved me wrong. But I hope you proved me right, because it'd be better for you. Better for me too. I really don't want to retract what I said, but I will if it's wrong. Now, as I said, the purpose of disciplining your children is to make them into godly adults. When they become teenagers and adults, their boss will not tolerate having to tell them something more than once. Or at least they shouldn't. I wouldn't if I was a boss. I would let my employees know right away. When I tell you to do something, you do it. Now, it's one thing if they got a million things on their plate and you add one more thing and they just didn't have enough time to get to it. I get that. But when you tell them specifically to do something and they don't do it, yeah, you're out of here. I'm not wasting my time with that. Now, allowing them to disobey your commandment the first time it's given could be deadly for them. And I am not using hyperbole here. I'm not trying to be an alarmist. I am serious. If you train your children that obedience is optional, it could be deadly for them. I'll give you 4 examples, and you could think of plenty more. For example, if you say to your kid, don't cross the street without an adult. You see that street right there, Johnny? Don't cross that street without an adult. What if Johnny says, you know what? Dad doesn't really mean what he says. I can cross the street at least 2 more times before I get a spanking. Could be deadly, right? Johnny could get run over. Or you tell them, don't walk on the ice on the river. Johnny says, bah, you know, Dad doesn't really mean that, obviously. I can probably walk across it 2 or 3 more times before I get a spanking. Could be deadly. I know about this. I was a foolish child one time that walked across an icy river. It was crazy. If my parents found out about it, they should have beaten me severely because I could have died very easily. And I was walking right up to the edge. There was still water. It wasn't all frozen over. I'm walking right up to the edge and looking over at the water. Craziest thing in the world. I literally could have died so easily. How about don't play with the gun? Or don't play with any gun? Oh, well, you know, Dad, he didn't really mean what he says. I can probably play with this gun. He's just saying that. Bang. He's dead. It's happened lots of times. Don't get in the car with a stranger. Kid doesn't obey your command because you've shown that you don't mean what you say. He jumps in the car with a stranger. Another thing that you don't want to fall into is this counting folly. Now, I don't know, I've never witnessed this with any of you, thank goodness, because when I see this kind of thing, and I've seen it before, I want to commit an atrocity. Have you ever seen this? The parent will say, and I'm sure you have, Johnny, come here. Johnny, 1, 2, 3. You ever see this? This is the worst form of parenting and child discipline I've ever seen in my life. It's the most irritating thing, and if you've ever done it, well, I'm glad I haven't seen it because I would have told you about it. The problem is that most of these parents that do this, I think, went to public schools and they actually can't count to 3. They only ever get to 2, and then they start repeating the only 2 numbers that they know. So they say, Johnny, 1, 2, Johnny, 1, 2, and they just keep repeating the first 2 numbers. The spanking actually never comes, right? But all this does is teach Johnny that he can disobey for at least 2.5 seconds before you're going to spank him, right? You don't need to count. Just say, Johnny, come here. He doesn't come here, he gets a spanking. Real simple. Do that for a week straight, you'll never have to give Johnny a spanking for not coming again. Or maybe he'll try to test you out after a while and see if you've lost your mettle or not, but chances are you're not going to have to give very many spankings after that. Now here's another point. Allowing disobedience in children who are church members is facilitating them getting excluded from the church, because that is an excludable offense. Let's look at Romans 1 and verse 30. Romans 1 and verse 30. This is a serious matter. This could have grave spiritual consequences for your children. Paul lists here people who have been turned over to a reprobate mind. And he says that people that do these things are worthy of death. And I've shown you in a previous study that this is a death to fellowship in God's church. He says there in Romans 1 and verse 30, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. Them that do such things are worthy of death, and one of those things is disobedient to parents. So if as a parent you have a child that is a church member that's still under your roof, and you allow them to be disobedient to you, you are facilitating their exclusion from the church. Now, I don't usually say a whole lot to people privately. If you want to know what I think about something, listen to my sermons. That's what I think about something. That's my counseling generally, is in sermons, okay? I tell you things from the pulpit. Now, if there's an excludable offense happening, or you're doing something really stupid that's really going to cause you a lot of pain or something, I'll probably step in, and I have, and I will say something. But generally speaking, when I preached on something, unless it's an excludable offense, I'm not going to say something to you about it. I'm just going to let it go. And I see lots of stuff in lots of you with child training and other things that I don't agree with. I don't agree, I would do things differently, I think anyway, and I don't agree with it. And there are things that are let go that I wouldn't let go. But this would be an exception. If you have a child that is a church member, and I see that child being disobedient to you, if you won't step in and make that child behave, I will. I will tell them, you better obey your parents and you better do it now, or we are going to exclude you from this church. I will do that. And furthermore, I would not baptize a disobedient and disrespectful child either. If I saw a child and they came to me and said they want to be baptized and they don't obey their parents, they give their parents attitude, they disrespect their parents, I would not baptize such a child. Part of the repentance of that child would be to act like a mature adult and to obey their parents. That would be a requirement for baptism. So especially, well, all your kids, but there is an extra level of seriousness when your kids are church members. So you never want to allow that in them. Okay, so we got rebellion, we got disobedience that ought to be met with the rod. The next thing is backtalk or disrespect. You never want to tolerate this. This should never be allowed or tolerated. Arguing with a command is rebellion and should be met with the rod. Think about this. If you allow your daughter to backtalk you, what do you think she's going to do to her husband? If you allow her to backtalk you as her father, she's going to backtalk her husband, right? You've taught her how it's to be done. For that matter, if you let your wife backtalk you in front of her, she's going to learn, I can backtalk my husband. That's just the way that it should be done. So do her and her future husband a favor and teach her to be submissive and respectful. Remember, preparing your kids for the real world. Don't allow your daughters to talk back to you if you don't want to cause them problems in their marriage someday. If you allow your son to backtalk you, he'll do it to his boss. Do him and his boss and anybody else he has to deal with, do them a favor and teach him to be submissive and respectful so that he doesn't get fired someday. Now, if your kids have questions, you say, well, it's just if I tell them to do something the first time and they don't immediately obey and I give them a spanking, well, how's that fair? What if they have a question about it? I have some Christian friends of mine, and what they do is that they teach their children, when they tell them to do something, they do it immediately. And then once you've done it, you can come back and ask me, why did you tell me to do that? Okay? But you don't question me when I've told you to do it, unless there's something the kid knows that I don't know. And like, well, if I do that, I'm going to get electrocuted or something, you know, I get that. But if it's go clean your room, you don't need to say, but why do I have to do it now? No. Spanking. No but. I don't want to hear. Yabbit is a British rabbit, as my brother says. No yabbits. Do it. You got a question about it after you've done what I told you? Then you come back. You ask. Eye rolling should never be tolerated. That is disrespect. I would never tolerate my son or daughter rolling their eyes at me when I told them to do something. If you roll your eyes at me and do what I told you to do, you're still getting a spanking because that is just the same as if you didn't do what I told you to do. That is disrespectful. Would you want your daughter to eye roll at her husband or to eye roll at other adults? Would you want your son to do that? I wouldn't. Sighing should never be tolerated. You tell your kid to do something and they say, and then they do it. You get a spanking and then you're going to do it. No sighing. No eye rolling. That's disrespectful. That is not the way that parents should be treated. Door slamming should never be tolerated. You tell your kid to do something, they get mad and they go and slam their door. They slam their door, you slam their butt. No door slamming, no eye rolling, no sighing, no back talking. That's disrespectful. Should not be tolerated. The next thing is lying. You must come down very hard on lying and deceit whenever you find it in a child. This is actually not my point. This is a point that I got from some friends of mine that got it from another pastor. And this makes good sense. That's why I put it in the outline. This is one thing that you want to come down very hard on, lying and deceit. You do not want to allow that in children. Because, remember, everything you allow in a child, you're teaching them. And if you allow lying and deceit and you don't punish it severely and immediately, you're teaching them that that's how you get out of trouble. That's what you do. If your kid knows that he can lie and there's not going to be severe consequences for it, then whenever he gets into the real world, every time he does something and he gets caught, he's going to lie about it and he's going to try to get out of it. And that's going to have severe consequences for him. This is one thing that if you don't nip it in the bud, it's going to be very hard to root out when they're older. Because if they have become accustomed to years of every time I get in trouble, I lie, That's going to be second nature to them. And their nature is going to be, I lie. Instead of, I tell the truth even when it costs me, it's going to be, I lie to get out of it. You don't ever want to teach your kids that. The next one is stealing. Stealing should be met with the rod. If you ever catch your child stealing, you should give him a severe beating with the rod and make him pay double for the item and apologize to the person it was stole from. If they steal something, if they're walking through the checkout line at Walmart and they steal a pack of gum, you find out about that, they get a severe beating, you make them pay double for the gum, you make them go back to the cashier and publicly apologize to that cashier for stealing that thing. Never want to allow that in your kids. The next thing is laziness. Let's turn to Proverbs chapter 10, verse 5. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 5. It says, he that gathereth in summer is a wise son, but he that sleepeth in harvest is a son that causeth shame. You don't want a lazy kid. You want a kid to grow up to be a bum? Be on welfare or something? No, you want to beat that foolishness out of him. If he's lazy, make the laziness be more painful than the work. That's what you got to do. Make it be more painful than the work that he doesn't want to do. Proverbs 29 and verse 15. Proverbs 29 and verse 15. Now, I'm not saying to work your kids to death or anything. I'm not saying that at all. But you're not stupid. You know laziness when you see it, right? Don't allow it. Proverbs 29 and verse 15. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. You leave that child to himself, he's going to be lazy, chances are, because for most people in the fallen human condition, leisure is preferable to labor, right? Most people would rather just sit there and do nothing than work hard. So if you leave the child to himself, chances are, unless he's odd, he's going to turn out to be lazy. You got to beat that foolishness out of him. If he, you don't have to. If you tell him to do something, he does it, fine. But if he wants to be lazy and you telling him to not be so doesn't work, then you got to take it up to the next level. The next thing would be hanging out with friends that are fools. You don't want to suffer this in your children because this could be their demise and destruction. Proverbs 28 and verse 7. Proverbs 28 and verse 7. It says, whoso keepeth the law is a wise son, but he that is a companion of riotous men shameth his father. You as a parent are going to be put to shame if you allow your children to hang out with foolish, riotous, sinful other teenagers. You're going to be put to shame. He that walketh with wise men shall be wise, but a companion of fools shall be destroyed, we're told in Proverbs 13 and verse 20. It's going to be your kid's destruction if you let him hang out with other fools or with fools. I know this from personal experience. And all the things I was saying yesterday about how stupid adolescents can be, you know how I know that? Well, part of it's personal experience. I was one, right? We all were one. So when I was saying those things, I'm not saying, that it's just the rest of kids were like that, but I wasn't. No, I was one of them. That's why I'm so adamant and strict about it. And I was allowed to hang out with fools when I was a kid. My parents probably didn't realize what fools I was hanging out with and what we were doing, which is kind of amazing to me, because when I have kids, it just seems like don't you think sometimes where you think your parents were so clueless to what was going on when you were a kid, and you think, well, how were they so clueless? Because they were kids one time and they know what kids do. So I don't know what happens when you become a parent, you become oblivious to what kids do, but I would hope when I become a parent I don't forget what I did as a kid, because man, just let your 16 or 17-year-old son run around all night long with his friends and stay at his friend's house, supposedly, and not even check with the friend's parents if he's actually there. And then his friend said that he was staying with you, and then the two of them were staying somewhere else, partying somewhere. Hello? I mean, it's amazing that some of the stuff that parents allow. I don't know. But anyway, you let them hang out with fools, they're going to destroy themselves. Thank God I didn't get destroyed. I could have been destroyed. Could have been ruined any number of ways, or dead. Thank God for His mercy. And of course, sin in general, right? You don't want to leave sin in general on your kids. If your child sins, then you ought to punish that. It needs punished some way, some form anyway, either with the rod or another way. Now, let's look at when children should begin to be disciplined. At what age should we begin disciplining children? Well, the Scripture teaches that the rod should be applied when needed early in life. Let's look at Proverbs 13 and verse 24. Proverbs 13 and verse 24. If you waited till they're 4 or 5 years old, you've waited way too long. Proverbs 13:24, he that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. There's a lot in this verse. We'll get to the first part of it later, but the second part is what we're looking at right now. He that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. Betimes means at an early time, period, or season, early in the year, early in life. So the father, the mother that chastens their children does so early in life. They don't waste any time. And I'll tell you how you know when it's time in just a second, if you don't already know. To chasten means to inflict disciplinary or corrective punishment on, to visit with affliction for the purpose of moral improvement, to correct, discipline, chastise. You see, when you chasten your children, it's not to destroy them. It is to improve them, to make them into better people. It just kills me when people say, oh, I love my child too much to spank him. I love my child too much to beat him with the rod. No, you love yourself too much. You don't love your child. If you loved your child, you would spank that foolishness out of him. You see, a parent who loves his child, or a parent loves his child who chastens him early in life. That's what this verse says. A parent hates his child who will not chasten him. If you will not chasten your child with a rod, you hate that child. That's what the Scripture says. He that spareth his rod hateth his son. I'm not making this stuff up. Now, to not discipline a child with the rod when he needs it is to suffer sin upon him and is an act of hatred. Let's look at Leviticus 19 and verse 17. I'm going to show you the principle here. Not chastening children when they need it is an act of hatred. And when you see this happening in people, I have a good question that we should ask them. Leviticus 19 and verse 17. Thou shalt not hate thy brother in thine heart. Thou shalt in any wise rebuke thy neighbor and not suffer sin upon him. This is not referring to child discipline, but this is referring to your brother having some sin that you know about, and you don't, the Scripture says, you don't let this sin be on him anymore. You rebuke him because you love him. Right? If you don't rebuke him, you hate him. If you suffer the sin, you hate him. Like I said, parents say that they love their children too much to punish them with a rod. They actually love themselves. They don't love their children. They love themselves. It would be a legitimate question to ask a parent why he hates his child when he's not spanking him when he needs it. The next time you see a parent who's not spanking their children when they're throwing a fit, a proper question would be just to tap them on the shoulder and say, I have a question. Why do you hate your child so much? Just wondering. That might actually sink down into their soul. Or maybe you'll be the one that'll get beaten, I don't know, instead of the child. But anyway, it'd be a good question to ask. God sets for us the pattern of chastening children. Hebrews 12, 5 through 8. You see, this is not the pastor's ideas, okay? I'm not coming up with this stuff. This is what God says to do. Hebrews 12, 5 through 8. It says, And ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. You see, if God loves his kids, he chastens them, and he chastens every single one of them. You see that? If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons, for what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? This is Paul's argument. If you're not chastened, you're not a son. What kind of a son are you if your parents will not chasten you? You're not even, they don't even believe that you're their son, apparently. But if you be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are ye bastards and not sons. You You see, a child, I wouldn't want to be a child that was without chastisement, because then I would wonder if I wasn't the son of the milkman or something. Because I'm apparently not a son because I'm not being beaten when I need it. Of course, kids don't think like that. But if you think logically and rationally, you'd come to that conclusion. So if your son ever comes up to you and says, "Dad, was I adopted?" you might wonder, have I been spanking him enough? Maybe he doesn't think he's my son anymore. Good fathers will follow God's lead. Let's read verses 9 through 11. Furthermore, here's Paul. Paul is reasoning from the lesser to the greater. Furthermore, we have had fathers of our flesh which corrected us, and we gave them reverence. See, that's that respect thing that I was talking about. No eye rolling and door slamming, that kind of thing. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? For they verily, that's the fathers on earth, for they verily for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Any kid can attest to that. It doesn't feel good to get your butt spanked with a rod, does it? It's not joyous, it's grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. I am definitely in favor of giving your children exercise. Exercise them with a rod. That's the best form of exercise that they can get. And the Father that loves them will do it. And look at what it does. It yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. It yields a peaceful child, a child who's not out of control. You know these kids, you see them, they're never spanked, they're never disciplined, and they're out of control. They're just a bundle of rage. You ever see it? I mean, you just see kids just throwing fits, throwing themselves on the floor and smashing their hands against the floor. You know what that kid needs? He needs a beating with the rod. He's out of control. He has turmoil. The kid is miserable. The thing to do is not to coddle him, it's to beat him. And that sounds mean, but I'm telling you, listen to the Bible. It yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. Never, but never allow your kid to throw a fit and throw himself on the floor. I would never, ever put up with that. That is ridiculous. You only have a short period of time to chasten them while there is hope, the Scripture teaches. Look at Proverbs 19 and verse 18. Then you wonder about these kids that end up going into schools and doing mass shootings and things. I've never seen any of the data. Did their parents chasten them? Or were they left to be a bundle of rage and it just built up and built up and built up and they finally couldn't take it anymore? I don't know. But it wouldn't surprise me. Proverbs 19 and verse 18. There's only a short time that you have. I think it was Hitler said to give us your kids until they're, 4 or 5 years old, and then you can have them back. If you take a child until they're 4 or 5 and teach them whatever you want to teach them, and it's going to be really hard to unteach them whatever was trained and instilled in them at that young age. Proverbs 19 and verse 18. Chasten thy son while there is hope, and let not thy soul spare for his crying. We'll get to the second half of that verse in a little bit. But chasten thy son while there is hope. You know what that tells me? There is a period of time when there's hope. But then, once that period is gone, there is not hope anymore. You have lost hope that your child is going to turn out the way that you want him to. You got to start early. Once a person gets to be a full-grown fool, it's too late then. Let's look at Proverbs 27 and verse 22. Proverbs 27:22. Though thou shouldest bray a fool in a mortar among wheat with a pestle, yet will not his foolishness depart from him. Now you can give a little kid a few spankings with the rod whenever he's little, and you took the foolishness out of him, and he understands that he knows where the bounds are, and he's not going to push those bounds from that point forward. He may need one once in a while. I mean, it's not like you give him a couple when he's 2 years old and he's never going to need one again. But chances are you've set him on a good path, and he's probably going to be all right as long as you just keep it up, right? But if you just let the kid do whatever he wants and he becomes a full-grown fool, then you could put him in a mortar and grind him to powder, and it will not depart from him. You don't want to let him get to that point. To bray means to beat small, to bruise, pound, crush, to powder, usually in a mortar. You see, 100 stripes to such a fool like that won't do what a few good ones will to a little child. Look in Proverbs 17 and verse 10. Proverbs 17 and verse 10. A reproof entereth more into a wise man than 100 stripes into a fool. You set the stage well for your kids when they're little. And then you don't need to be beating them every time you turn around. Just one word of reproof and you have trained them well, right? One word of reproof is going to get that little guy going in the path that he should. And yet, the other guy that was never disciplined, you could give him 100 stripes once he becomes a full-grown fool, and it's not going to help. Now, it says there that they that love their children should chasten them betimes. And betimes means early in life. But what does that mean exactly? Well, I would say here's your rule of thumb. As soon as a child starts trying to exert his will over his parents' will, that's when chastening must begin. Whatever age that is, and it's probably going to happen before 1 year of age, whenever that child starts exerting his will over your will must reign supreme. And that's when the chastening must begin. This can be as young as probably 6 to 9 months old, whenever they start exerting their will. You break the will, not the spirit. You don't want to break their spirit, but you want to break the will. Why would you allow willful disobedience in a child, no matter what the age? Why would you allow it? You shouldn't. If you love them anyway. If you hate them, well, go ahead. Let them do whatever they want. This will happen long before the child is old enough to speak his opposition to your rules. You don't have to wait until he's old enough to talk, to where he has to tell you no. Well, he can tell you no without speaking the words. You parents that have had kids, you know what I'm talking about, right? Can they not speak their opposition to you without actually speaking? They can tell you, right? By their actions, by whatever they do. You want to take care of major flaws in your children? This is another point that is not mine. It's a point of a friend of mine. Take care of major flaws in your children while they are young and the problem is little by whatever hurts the kid the most, her words, not mine, usually spanking, but sometimes other things are more poignant, especially if they are mixed with the rod. So you want to get rid of the major flaws early. If you see big flaws in your kids when they're little, take care of that now. Because if you don't, those big flaws are going to become bigger and they're going to become ingrained and they're going to become part of their character. You wonder why us as adults, some of us, we struggle with certain things that we never fixed from whenever we were kids, right? We had that issue when we were kids and we were never disciplined and that was never driven out of us and we still struggle with it today. Don't let that happen to your kids. Take care of those big flaws early by whatever means is necessary. Don't wait until your kids are older and then kick yourself, her words, not mine, for certain things you allowed or dismissed that are now bigger problems because the kid is bigger. Take care of the problems when they're little. It'd be like finding a nest of rattlesnake eggs in your house and think, well, I'll let them go for a while and take care of it later. No, you take care of it now. Take care of the problem early. Now, when should a child be chastened in relationship to the time of the offense? Well, parents should correct their children as quickly as possible after the need for correction arises. And I've already got into this earlier. In other words, when the child has done something improper, the correction should be given quickly. Because the thing is with kids, the smaller they are, the shorter their memories are, and they're not going to associate the spanking with the bad behavior, especially when they're wee little, if any time takes place, right? You can't wait an hour and then spank a 1-year-old kid or a 2-year-old kid or something. They're not going to remember what even happened, right? As soon as the thing happens, then you spank them. You don't want to put time in between there. This helps the child to associate the improper behavior with the pain of the correction, resulting eventually in corrected behavior. You want them to understand bad behavior, pain, right? This is the way nature works. Right? Don't touch the stove. They walk up and they touch the stove. Pain, right? That's what happens. This is what happens. It's called natural consequences. You don't want to have severe natural consequences happen to your children, right? You don't want to say, don't get close to that fire, don't walk across that street, and then have the natural consequences happen to where the child really gets hurt. Make them associate the pain with the disobedience. Putting off disciplining the child until you are at your wit's end could result in losing your temper and hurting the child. You know, parents that just think they never want to spank their kids. Oh, I just love them too much. I don't want to spank them. I can't imagine spanking a little kid. You know what's going to happen? They're going to get worse and worse and worse, and you're going to get more frustrated, and eventually you're going to get to the point where you just can't take it anymore, and when you finally do spank them, you could actually harm them. And you don't want to actually harm them. You want to cause them pain, which lasts temporarily. That's what a spanking does. But you don't want to permanently harm them, and you don't want to seriously harm them. You don't want to do that. So don't put it off. Do it immediately. And here's another one. You never want to discipline your children when you're so angry that you're not in control of yourself. You want to calm down and then punish them. And I'm sure any parent ever been there? You ever been really, really mad? Your kids just did something that just infuriated you, right? I'm sure you've been there, right? I can imagine that could happen, right? You don't want to punish your children when you're in that state of mind. You never want to spank them whenever you're just furious. Calm down. Calm down. Know exactly what you're doing. Purpose in your heart how many strikes you're going to give them. And then when you're calm and you're in your right mind, then do it. Don't do it while you're angry. You could end up hurting your child, and you don't want to do that. Now, if you're in a public place where it would not be wise to discipline your children, then tell them that they're going to get it when they get home, and make sure that you follow through with it no matter how good the rest of the day is. And that's the key to it. If you're out in public and your kid is acting out, he's acting up, and you tell him, and you're right in the middle of it, and you can't spank him because maybe the culture that we live in today, you'd get turned in or something. You just whisper to him, when we get home, you're getting a spanking. And it doesn't matter how good the rest of the day goes. It doesn't matter if he's a perfect angel. You remember that, and you give him the spanking when he gets home. And then the next time you're in the store and you give him the look, he knows, I will get the spanking when I get home. So you never want to, because I remember when I was a kid, my dad would get mad at us, we'd be in the car or something. When you get home, you're getting a spanking. And then it's like, okay, let's see how good we can be and how much fun we can have so Dad will forget about it. And he probably did forget about it sometimes. But don't do that. Don't forget about it. Is it easy? No, I'm sure that's not easy. I'm sure that's really hard. But is it the right thing to do? I think so. Now, how should children be disciplined? I've sort of gotten into this already, but let's go ahead and cover this. The primary method of correction should be beating with a rod. Now, I know some people don't like this. They don't even like the word beating. You say you got to beat your children with a rod, and that's offensive to some people. But you know what? Your problem is not with me. Your problem is with God, because God is the one that says it. Your problem's not with me. It's with God. Proverbs 13 and verse 24. He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. You spare the rod, you hold back that rod, you hate your child. Now, if you don't believe that, you don't believe God. It's not that you don't believe Pastor Wagner. Proverbs 22 and verse 15. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him. The rod of correction. It'll drive the foolishness out of him. Proverbs 23 and verse 13 through 14. Withhold not correction from the child. This is telling you, do not withhold it. For if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die. It ain't going to kill him. It's going to help him. Listen to this. Imperative commandment. Thou shalt beat him with the rod and shalt deliver his soul from hell. God says, beat your child with the rod. That's what God says. Proverbs 29 and verse 15. I don't care what anybody says about it. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. There's what happens when you don't give the rod. It gives wisdom. It's a form of teaching them. You wonder why when somebody gets a spanking and we say that that smarts, gives wisdom, right? Don't be scared of the word beat. I know a lot of people are scared of this. They don't like using that word, especially in today's political environment. It doesn't really mean all that much different from spanking, actually. And I use the word beat because the Bible uses the word beat. And because it offends snowflakes too, so I like to do that, of course. Beat means to strike with repeated blows. To strike means to deal a blow, to smite with the hand, occasionally another limb, a weapon or tool. It means to deal a person or an animal a blow, to hit with some force, either with the hand or with a weapon. That's what it means to strike. Now, to spank means to slap or smack, especially a person or a child, with the open hand. To slap means to strike or smack a person or thing smartly with the open hand or with something having a flat surface like a paddle. To hit on or upon or over in this way. To smack means to strike a person, part of the body, etc., with an open hand or with something having a flat surface, like a paddle again. To slap. So to beat means to strike, to beat means to strike, and then to spank means to slap or smack, and to slap or smack means to strike. Beat means to strike, spank means to strike. There's not a whole lot of difference between the two of them. Now the rod should be the primary instrument of punishment, as we saw from the verses we just read. A rod is a straight, slender shoot or wand growing upon or cut from a tree, bush, etc. Like the old-timers. Go cut yourself a switch. That's what they used to tell their kids. Then the kid had to go pick the switch. You don't want to pick one too big. You pick one too small, that's kind of painful too. They probably try to pick a rotten one or something that would break and not work very well. And then I suppose they get it even worse. A wand is a straight, slender stick. Now in Scotland, and a dialect, I don't know what that means. Anyway, in Scottish use, chiefly a slender, pliant stick cut from a stem or branch of a shrub or young tree. That's what a rod is. A dowel rod would work just fine as well. I know parents that use dowel rods. Now a beating should be painful. Well, there's a surprise, right? The whole point of a beating is that it's painful. If the beating is not painful, then just save your time. A slap with the hand on a diaper is worthless. You ever see parents do this? Their kid's in diapers and they give them a slap with the hand on the diaper. And then the kid starts crying. He's putting on a show. It doesn't hurt, right? Take a diaper and slap your hand against it. That is not that's not discipline. That doesn't hurt. A beating should cause tears. You say, oh, you're so harsh. No. Proverbs 19 and verse 18. It's God that's harsh, not me. Proverbs 19 and verse 18. Chasten thy son while there is hope, and let not thy soul spare for his crying. That tells me when you chasten your son with a rod, he's going to cry. And you know what the Bible says? Don't stop when he starts crying. That's what God says. Don't stop when he starts crying. Let not thy soul spare for his crying. Crying is the action of the verb cry in its various senses, shouting, lamentation, weeping, etc. Don't stop when you start to hear that. You don't want to be fooled by fake tears and crying. Look, kids will figure this out. They know as soon as you tell them they're getting a spanking, they'll start crying before you ever spank them. Right? You can't, don't let not your soul spare for their crying. Don't stop as soon as the kid lets out a cry. If you do, the child's going to quickly learn that all they have to do is start wailing after the first strike and it ends. Right? They figure it out. That's why God says, don't let your soul stop for their crying. Spare. If the punishment is not sufficiently painful, it won't stop the bad behavior. Why do you think that parents that slap their kid on the diaper with their hand still have the same problems over and over again? Because it doesn't hurt. It doesn't stop the behavior. You want to determine beforehand how many strikes the infraction merits, and don't stop until you've given that many, regardless of the yelling and the crying from the child. Let not thy soul spare for his crying. If he needs 2, give him 2. If he needs 3 or 4, if he needs a bunch of them, you give him a bunch of them. It depends what the infraction was. Correction should be grievous. Remember we read in Hebrews 12 and verse 11, said the correction is not joyous but grievous. Correction should be grievous. Let's look in Proverbs 15 and verse 10. Correction is grievous unto him that forsaketh the way, and he that hateth reproof shall die. Now the rod may leave bruises, which are a sign that the foolishness has been driven out. Look in Proverbs 20 and verse 30. It says, the blueness of a wound cleanseth away evil, so do stripes the inward parts of the belly. The blueness of a wound, it's a bruise. It cleanses away evil. Naturally, if you take a dowel rod and you whack somebody on the butt with it, it could leave a bruise, right? It's not going to kill them. It cleanses away evil. Now, though it should be painful, a beating should not be excessive, it should not cause injury, and it should not be cause long-lasting pain to the child. Naturally, just do the experiment with yourself. Take a rod and whack yourself in the butt with it, or have your spouse whack yourself in the butt with it. It hurts, right? What's it going to hurt? A minute, a few minutes, it's going to hurt. You know, your butt might be a little red after that. It's not going to kill you, right? It's not going to cause any kind of lasting damage. God is not cruel. He knows what he's talking about. A beating with the rod will not kill the child. Look at Proverbs 23 and verse 13. Proverbs 23:13. Withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die. You're not going to kill him. It's going to be good for him. Rather, it's going to save him more severe punishment later on in life. Verse 14, thou shalt beat him with the rod and shalt deliver his soul from hell. If you don't beat your children with the rod, you are going to facilitate hell in their lives. They are going to go through hell in this life because of their foolishness that you allowed. So this is beating the hell out of your children. I'm okay with beating the hell out of your children, biblically speaking. Thou shalt beat him with the rod, thou shalt deliver his soul from hell. Now, once the punishment has been given, then you should affirm your love to them. This will show them that you hate their behavior, not them. You love them, which is why you spank them. You hate their behavior. So you give your displeasure to their behavior, and then you hug and embrace them, and you let them know that you love them, but you hated their behavior. This is what God did too. He punished Christ, remember? Because he hated the sin, and then he embraced Christ after the punishment was over. This should be done so that they understand that you punish them because you love them. This will also show them a picture of God's punishment of sin and subsequent forgiveness and forgetfulness of it. So once you've punished your child, then you don't keep bringing it up. You don't keep chastening them for that. Once you've punished them, then it's over and you forget about it. Now let's look at some other methods of disciplining children. Some punishments are more effective than others with different children. With older kids, sometimes taking away privileges works for them. That might work. I got this idea just from somebody the other day. Making older children pay a fine to you from their savings every time they disobey or delay obedience can be very effective. Make them pay a fine. You don't like that?
Spare the rod, spoil the child.
Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, I do think that the rod is the primary, and I agree. The rod is the primary, but whenever you get kids that are older, sometimes those type of punishments can be effective. And they can work because this is, I mean, you're preparing them for the real world. This is what's going to happen in the real world. You break the law, you pay the fine kind of thing. So, and God had fines in the Old Testament that you'd pay when you broke laws. So I don't have an issue with this, but not with little kids, but when they get to be older. But the thing is, if you do it right, you probably won't have to come up with inventive punishments when they get older. But anyway, so you start off by charging them $1 every time they disobey. And if that doesn't work, then you increase the amount. This will only be effective if you make them work for their money and only buy them their basic necessities and make them buy themselves the things that they want. And we're going to talk about that more. Now, if you provide your kids everything that they want, what's it matter if you're taking from their bank account or not? They get everything they want. If they want something, they just ask for it. But if you only provide them their basic necessities like food and clothing, and then you make them work and save up money and buy the things they want, the toys and all that kind of stuff, then this method could work. Tailoring punishments with crimes such as washing out a mouth with soap for lying or flicking a mouth, for talking back are options. That works. I've seen that work. If you start when they're very young and you're consistent, then you shouldn't have to worry about coming up with creative ideas for punishment when they are teenagers, because they should be well-behaved and well-mannered young adults by that point. Chances are, if you're still having to beat them when they're teenagers, you probably didn't take care of it early enough in their lives, I would say. Let's talk about the importance of consistency. You must be consistent when it comes to punishments for offenses. You don't want to punish a child today for something that you allowed yesterday, or pass over an offense today for something that you punished them for yesterday. That's not fair to them, and it's sending them mixed signals, and then they're not going to know when to obey, when not to obey. They're not going to know if they do a certain thing today, they're going to be punished severely for it because you're in a bad mood, but if they do it tomorrow, nothing may happen. You want to be consistent as much as you can. Like I said earlier, you want to punish them the first time and every time they disobey or behave badly. The first time and every time. Mean what you say and keep your word. You don't want to say something like this, and I've seen this before. I've seen my brother will do this nonsense. If you do that again, you're not going to grandma's tomorrow. And then by and large, or lo and behold, everybody goes to grandma's tomorrow, even though they didn't do it, right? So they learn quickly that he doesn't mean what he says, he's just threatening, and then it's ineffective anyway. So if you say it, you better just think about what you say, because if you want to threaten them with not going to grandma's tomorrow, you better think about it and think, okay, do I really want to hold them at home and not let them go to grandma's? Because if I make the threat, I've got to follow through with whatever the threat is. So you want to be careful with that. If you don't follow through, the child's going to quickly figure out that you're a liar and that you don't mean what you say, and that they're not actually going to get the punishment that you're threatening. You don't want to let your kids get away with something just because you're tired or because you've had such a good day with them that you don't want to ruin it with a spanking. Anybody ever been there? You ever had such a good day and then at the end they do something that they need a spanking for, and then you think, oh, why? Why? We had such a good day. You don't want to let it go. You don't want to let it go unless you hate your kids. You can let it go if you hate your kids, but if you love them, you don't want to let it go. And just because you're tired, don't let them off the hook. Just because you're tired doesn't mean you get a pass on bad parenting. Let's look at some other considerations. If your child's sick, you want to take that into consideration. If they're acting up, you don't want to give them too much leeway, but if they're sick, sometimes, you know, they're little and they can't control themselves like we can. And we may feel like lashing out at people when we're sick and we have enough control. So you want to take that into consideration. Don't let them go crazy, but I wouldn't punish a child for the exact same thing that if he's really sick and cranky and tired than I would if he was in good working order. Here's a difficult one, but I'm going to cover this anyway. If you have a child that is mentally or physically handicapped, don't let their affliction stop you from disciplining them. This is a trap that a lot of parents fall into. If they have a mentally or a physically disabled child, they end up giving that child a pass because they feel bad for him and they don't want to punish him, or they don't think they can punish him if he's mentally disabled. And I don't buy this at all, at least in most cases and circumstances. If they can understand your instruction, and if they intentionally disobey it, they should be disciplined regardless if they're mentally retarded or developmentally challenged. Hear me. If they can understand your instruction and they disobey it, they should be punished. Period. I don't care what their IQ is. I don't care if they have autism. I don't care if they're Down syndrome or whatever. If they understand, now if they don't understand, that's different. But if they understand your instruction and they disobey it, they should be punished. Now you cannot expect the same level of performance out of them, just as you would not punish a 3-year-old for the same thing that you would punish a 12-year-old for. But disobedience and bad behavior of afflicted children should still be punished appropriately. So just like you would punish different aged children
for different infractions, because as they grow older, they should know better. You wouldn't punish a 3-year-old. You punish a 12-year-old for something that you definitely wouldn't punish a 3-year-old for. Same thing with mentally or physically disabled children. You want to tailor the punishment to their level, to their intellect. Autistic children are difficult to raise, and some parents say that they cannot be disciplined like other children. I have an aunt and uncle that have an autistic son. He's now 18, and he's pretty severely autistic. I mean, he'll never be able to live on his own or anything like that. He'll never be able to drive a car or anything. He's a fairly severe case. And when he was little, they were of the opinion, oh, we can't spank him. Spanking just doesn't work. He doesn't understand. I don't buy that for a second. I watched them put vinegar in his mouth whenever he disobeyed, and then he got mad, he didn't like that, and then he stopped the behavior. I mean, I don't want to hear that. I don't believe that. I just don't. If the child understands when he does something wrong and he can associate pain with doing wrong, then he can and should be punished for disobedience. Even animals who are not rational creatures can have their behavior corrected by being punished for undesirable actions. An animal, a dog, a cat, right? You can correct the dog's behavior, and he certainly doesn't have rational faculty. He does not have an IQ above about 3, right? But he can be punished, and he can associate pain with disobedience. So can an autistic child. Training is not an exact equivalent to teaching. One can train where academic teaching is inefficient. One can train a sapling or a dog or a child by manipulation, rewards, and punishment to achieve a desired product. A parent of a developmentally challenged child, or any child for that matter, should ask themselves just who is doing the manipulating in the home, the parent or the child. Because developmentally challenged, mentally retarded, physically handicapped children will manipulate you. They will. And you don't want to let that happen because it's terrible for them. You are going to ruin them. And I have an example for that in just a second. Comforting the feeble-minded should not be construed as excusing the feeble-minded bad behavior, right? Comforting them, yes, but don't excuse the bad behavior. Allowing a mentally or physically handicapped child to get away with bad behavior is not loving him, but hating him because he will be a terror to himself and to others for the rest of his life. Anybody ever heard of Helen Keller? Right? We all know Helen Keller's story. Helen Keller's parents let her become hellish Keller until a tutor put a stop to the unacceptable behavior. This woman was blind, deaf, and dumb. Her parents felt really bad for her, and they let her do whatever she wanted. And she was horrible. She was a terror until I think her name was Annie Sullivan came in, and she beat that girl. She beat her. And you know what? She turned out just fine after that. Once she beat her and got her under control, then she taught her to communicate through hand, sign language in the hand that she could feel. If Annie Sullivan would never have come along and Helen Keller's bad parents would have continued to raise her, Helen Keller would have probably been in some mental institution, in some room with padded walls and a straitjacket or something. But I'm sure they said, oh, I just love her too much. I feel bad for her. No, you don't love her too much. If you loved her, you would have beat her like Annie Sullivan did. Don't feel like you should excuse bad behavior because you feel bad for their disadvantages. You will only make them worse off. Of course, feel bad for their disadvantages. That's really sad. And comfort them, encourage them, help them to accept who they are and what their limitations are. Of course, show them love, show them lots of love, but you don't allow their bad behavior because that's going to end up ruining them. Now, if children are tired, or especially if you're the one that kept them out late, then you want to factor that into their misbehaving, because when kids are tired, it's harder for them to control themselves. And you want to give a little leeway there, I would say. God remembers that we are but flesh and is compassionate towards our weakness, and we, or you as parents, ought to be so toward your children. Look at Psalm 78, 38 through 39. I'm just about done here. Just got a couple more things to say and we'll be through. And my voice is already through. Psalm 78, 38 through 40. Psalm 78, 38 through 40. Speaking of God, but he being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity, and destroyed them not. Yea, many a time turned he his anger away, and did not stir up all his wrath. For he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passeth away, and cometh not again. You see, God was merciful because he realized that they were but flesh. And as parents, you ought to be merciful and realize that your children are sinners like you as well, especially whenever their situation is abnormal, when they're tired or sick or something like that. Now, lastly, just a couple little points here and we'll be done. Where should children be disciplined? They should be disciplined consistently at home. If you take care of it at home, you don't have to worry about it in public. You're not going to have to be seen spanking your kid at the grocery store or something if you take care of it consistently at home. Maybe once in the grocery store, they'll maybe push it. You know, they're gonna test the limits every time they get in a new environment, new situation. But once you take care of that, then they know, okay, grocery store is just like at home. I can't act like an idiot, and then that won't be an issue. Don't let the only beatings you give your kids be in public because you're embarrassed at how they're acting and you don't want to appear like that parent that doesn't discipline their kids. So you spank them when they're in public so everybody sees that you're doing what you should or something. You don't want to go there. You don't want to let dinner time be mayhem at home and then expect to not be embarrassed by your unruly children at a restaurant. So if dinner time's good and peaceable at home, then it'll be like that when you go to a restaurant. If it's not, then don't be surprised if your kids are running all over the restaurant and making a bunch of noise and embarrassing you. You got to do it at home first and then do it in public. Don't let your kids run around screaming all day long at home and then expect them to be still and quiet in church for half an hour or for an hour and a half. Right? It would be hard for children who are accustomed to just never sitting still, never being made to behave, then to come here and sit for an hour and a half. That would be difficult. And that's probably why, I'm sure that there would possibly be families that would come to this church and wouldn't even come here because there's no program for the kids and they couldn't imagine their kids sitting here quiet for an hour and a half. And on this note, if you do need to play church at home during the week where you make them sit quietly and listen to or watch a sermon, then I'd recommend doing that. And I know people that have done that over the years, especially when their kids are wee little. And it's, because when they're under a year old and they're squirming and they're making noise and even when they're 2, they're wanting to move around a lot. So practice at home. Sit down, pop a sermon in, and just tell them we're going to play church. And you're going to sit here and you're going to be quiet and you're going to watch the sermon for an hour and a half. And then they'll learn how it's done ahead of time. So that's all I have to say about child discipline. And that's all my voice can handle. Next time, I'm going to get into the first of the 4 major areas of child training and development, and that is physical development.